Good afternoon. How's everybody feeling? My name is Ed Yarborough, and I have the privilege of welcoming you today to what is the third now in a series of free CLE programs sponsored by the Historical Committee of the Nashville Bar Association. And the purpose that we, I would say, originally had, I think it's grown a little bit, mission creep, whatever you want to call it, but the purpose was to put into a formal program the involvement of Nashville lawyers in some of the great events of our history, including Baker versus Carr, which was done in this room 4 years ago, almost to the day, right after the election. And then last year, we covered the Hoffa trial, the Test Fleet case that happened here in Nashville back in 1962. And obviously this year, we have chosen to shed some light on the trials and so-called scandals of the Ray Blanton era in the early 70s. The purpose, there are many purposes, but I guess the main purpose of a program like this is so that we can inform our members, particularly our younger members when possible, of what great involvement and achievements Nashville lawyers have had in some of these pivotal events, particularly the one-man, one-vote case, which really originated in Tennessee, as you know, and also was involved a lot of Nashville lawyers and non-lawyers, for that matter. I have to remember who to thank, and there's so many people, I'm afraid I'll leave somebody out. I actually want to start with John Mclemore, because even though he's not on the official list to be thanked, John, for many years, led the Historical Committee of the Bar, and he is the one that just showed up at a meeting about 5 years ago and said, we need to do something about the 50th anniversary of Baker versus Carr. And Mclemore is always getting me in trouble. He got me to join the Bar Association in 1976 when I left the DA's office, and immediately put me on the board of the docket, the newsletter, and made me take pictures at the picnic and the annual meeting and spend hours and hours in his dark room for about 20 years. So if you don't want to work for the Bar Association, stay away from John Mclemore. But the reason I single him out is that I really think that was the spark that led us into this series, which we hope will continue, even though we have no idea of what we're going to do next year, do we? Other people that definitely need thanking are Ken Oliver and his staff here at the library. The library has turned out to be a perfect venue for these programs. And the space that you're in now, the space behind the overflow area, and all these facilities that you see today are being used without charge by the Bar Association as a courtesy of the downtown library and their great staff. And so I think we certainly owe them a debt of gratitude. There are other people. Demetria Kaladimos is here today, and we're just delighted to have her. She has helped us a lot in going back and finding some of the historical footage that you'll see today of some of the pivotal events involving Governor Blanton, and she has an interest in history herself, as you know, as a documentarian, and so we're delighted that she was able to come and also participate in the preparation. Judge Bill Koch, or Dean Bill Koch, I don't know if I see him, was in on some of our early meetings. He was part of this committee and also provided a lot of help in coming up with a good timeline that he had actually done, I think, for the presentations on the early swearing in, and also was famous, I think, in the first meeting for warning us that we did not want to dance on anyone's grave today, and so we will not be doing that. We're going to try to present a fair and balanced account of what happened during the Blanton years and let the chips fall where they may. The last thing I want to do before turning it over to the aforementioned Mr. Mclemore is give a quick plug for NBA membership. As you know, anyone who was already a member of the Bar Association is here today without charge. This is a benefit that we are delighted to be able to provide for members of the Nashville Bar Association, 3 hours of, we hope, good quality CLE. And at the same time, we want to encourage you to become a part of the organization, to join a committee and be more active in the bar if you can, because all of us who have participated in the preparation of this program and the people that you're going to see on the stage today, I would say, without exception, have benefited from their membership in the bar over many, many years. And we think that ought to continue, and we encourage you, if you're not already a member of the Bar Association, to give it a look. And now we go to our favorite leadoff man. That would be Mr. John Mclemore, former reporter for the Nashville Banner, practicing bankruptcy law here in the city of Nashville, and he's going to give you a somewhat political but historical view of the Ray Blanton governorship.
Thank you, Ed. If you've read Tony Horowitz's Confederates in the Attic, you will recall his description of the descendants of both the Yankee and rebel soldiers at Shiloh, who take their posts on the battlefield as the sun sets each April the 6th. They want to stand as close as possible to their ancestors' positions. Many spend the entire night, and for those near the Shiloh Methodist Church, the rising sun illuminates the prominent gravestone of Leonard Ray Blanton, farmer, teacher, road builder, state representative, U.S. congressman, governor of Tennessee, and friend of the people. He was born in 1930. He died in 1996. That is the end of the story. My job this afternoon is to tell you how it began. 2 portraits hung in Governor Blanton's office in the Capitol, one of Andrew Jackson, the other of Harry Truman. Blanton managed to exhibit the worst qualities of each. Jackson symbolized the view that the spoils of victory, all of them, belong to the victor. In preparation for this program, it was pointed out that there may be young lawyers here who do not understand the term patronage. And so I'm going to stop and explain it very quickly, because the story of the Blanton administration is a story in large part of patronage and pork. Patronage, according to my American heritage, at definition number 5, the power or action of distributing governmental or political positions. Let's assume you lived in Morgan County during the term of Governor Ray Blanton, and you had a son who desperately wanted to be a guard at Brushy Mountain State Prison. You would have gone to the county patronage chief and argued your case. There's a good chance, if you assured the patronage chief that your son was a yellow dog Democrat, meaning that he would vote for a yellow dog if the yellow dog was on the Democrat side of the ballot, you would probably be in luck, and you would find that your son would be on the next list for the prison guard training program. That is patronage. Pork, on the other hand, is just about the same thing, but it extends to the county executive and the mayor of Wartburg going to the patronage chief and asking for a 200-cell extension on Brushy Mountain to create a massive construction project and perhaps as many as 200 new guard jobs. That is pork. Like Harry Truman, Blanton displayed a fierce loyalty to his friends and cronies and was quick to become very abrasive with reporters or anyone else who criticized them. Unlike Harry Truman, however, Blanton lacked judgment, a sense of history, and respect for his office. Leonard Ray Blanton began life in 1930 literally dirt poor. His father, Leonard, was originally a tenant farmer. The family fortunes began to improve during World War II when the elder Blanton found work in construction, although he continued to farm at night. Blanton attended Shiloh High School in Hardin County, where he won an award for scholarship. He attended UT Martin for his first year in college and was a classmate of Ned Ray McWhirter, who subsequently dropped out. Blanton transferred to UT Knoxville and focused on education and agriculture, receiving a BS degree in 1951. After the war, Blanton's father obtained bank loans to start B&B Asphalt Paving Company and B&B Construction Company. Ray joined the B&B entities in 1952 after teaching for a year in Indiana. Blanton positioned himself in the populist wing of the conservative Democratic Party. He had a chip on his shoulder, and he felt that folks like him had always been taken for granted. Blanton identified with the poor, rural white workers and blue-collar farmers who he saw as victims of the establishment. He grew up opposed to the death penalty. He saw people in jail as victims of laws enacted by the wealthy and powerful. He saw the white, poor, and blacks paying sales tax on every penny they earned, while the rich manipulated the tax laws and never paid their fair share. Blanton could be loyal to a fault, and as he entered the world of business and politics, he gathered lieutenants who would be with him for the remainder of his career. As this program progresses, you are going to hear the names of the Blanton Cronies repeatedly. Unlike a good commander, however, Blanton did not discipline his officers. Listen for these names as the program progresses: Eddie Shaw, Shorty Freeland, Eddie Sisk, Jim Allen, Frank Phillips, Jack Ham, Gene Blanton, the governor's brother. Eddie Shaw was a high school classmate of Blanton's and later owned a restaurant known as Catfish Eddie's. Shaw was also on the board of the Hardin County Bank, a major source of funding for B&B construction. He later became Blanton's Commissioner of Transportation. In 1964, Shorty Freeland, who would become Special Administrative Assistant to the Governor and head of statewide patronage, sparked Blanton's interest in running for office. The first race was for the state legislature. Blanton was successful in an uncontested election and went to Nashville in 1965, representing Henderson and McNairy counties. During his single term, on those occasions when he was present, Blanton sat at the rear of the House chamber wearing sunglasses and observing the passing scene. The sunglasses were perhaps an indicator of his prodigious use of alcohol. Nonetheless, Blanton witnessed the end of an era when Tennessee's governors influenced the selection of the speakers of the House and the Senate. The legislature, in turn, determined who would hold the powerful offices of Secretary of State, Comptroller, and Treasurer. The legislature met for only 75 days every 2 years. Individual members needed the nod of the governor for approval of projects in their counties during the 21 and a fraction months they were not in Nashville. When it came to pork or patronage, the governor was king. In 1965, Blanton was a prime sponsor of a reapportionment bill to comply with Baker versus Carr. A companion bill created a new congressional districts that, among other things, split Shelby County into 3 parts and created a new 7th district. The incumbent in that area was Congressman Jim Murray of Jackson, who was part of the powerful Crump-McKellar political machine in West Tennessee. The next year, Eddie Shaw and Shorty Freeland helped Blanton organize his primary campaign, which he won by 364 votes out of 70,000 cast. He would win a contested general election and go to Congress. Blanton was to serve 3 terms in the U.S. House, where he was good at constituent services, good at pork, and highly visible in his district. He was a traditional Southern Democrat, but voted for the 1966 Civil Rights Bill largely through the intercessions of former Governor Buford Ellington, who, as Lyndon Johnson's Director of Emergency Management, was in reality Johnson's bagman with state delegations. Perhaps not coincidentally, shortly after Blanton's vote on the Civil Rights Bill, a way was found for the state of Tennessee to acquire all of TVA's property adjacent to Pickwick Dam, which in turn became Pickwick Landing State Park. While in Congress, Blanton served only on the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee and the District of Columbia Committee. According to Ralph Nader's Congress Project, the most prominent feature of Blanton's committee work was his inactivity and absenteeism. Blanton was clearly focused on his district and being visible in it. Whenever an award or grant was made that impacted his district, Blanton's office could be counted on to trumpet his success, whether that was getting a new gorilla for the Memphis Zoo or having the first Head Start program in the state. He did not like the EPA. He would talk in one direction, but the fact was he was in favor of draining wetlands and anything else that might help farmers, and he thought the EPA was not good for agriculture. He was critical of school busing, and he was critical of the anti-war movement. In 1972, Blanton decided not to run for re-election and to leave Congress. His decision was based less on altruism and more on the fact that the 1970 census caused Tennessee to lose one of its congressional districts. He was a junior congressman and volunteered to step down or get defeated by a very popular Ed Jones. Seemingly having nothing better to do, Blanton decided to run against Howard Baker for the United States Senate. Eddie Sisk was named his campaign manager. Baker was popular, and so was Richard Nixon in the presidential year when the Democratic nominee was George McGovern, who was not popular. Blanton was hurt from his right by his apparent but not real civil rights record and his vote for the 1966 Civil Rights Act. Democrats were not enthusiastic either, as Blanton seized upon busing and the appointment of L. Clure Morton to the federal bench in Nashville as his key issues. If all of this was not enough, Blanton had voted against extending the Voting Rights Act and lowering the voting age to 18. He was also criticized for being a George Wallace supporter, as some of his operatives certainly were, specifically an aide, Jim Allen. When Blanton reached the governor's office, Allen briefly served as a special assistant before leaving the administration to deal with the allocation of political favors, most specifically liquor licenses. It may have been funny to grease the tracks and stall Baker's campaign train, but as Richard Nixon would soon learn, you were not supposed to get caught playing dirty tricks. A Blanton campaign worker, James Brown, earned the nickname the Crisco Kid for his antics in that particular event. For the first time in Tennessee, not one single newspaper endorsed the Democratic candidate for the Senate. Blanton had a disaster. He lost to Howard Baker 716,000 votes to 444,000, which is about half. He got about half as many votes as his opponent. While a disaster at the time, Blanton's 1972 campaign provided the opportunity to build a statewide organization to run for governor in 1974. By then, the country and Tennessee had changed. The scandals of the Nixon administration and his resignation, coupled with unpopularity of Winfield Dunn in East Tennessee, where he'd opposed a new medical school in Johnson City and foisted a new regional prison on the citizens of Morristown, provided a ripe opportunity for any Democratic nominee. In addition to having some statewide name recognition and campaign organization, Blanton benefited from being one in a field of 12 candidates in the Democratic Party. This made it impossible for the press to cover all the candidates and give any one of them the exposure to emerge from the pack. On August 2nd, 1974, Blanton prevailed in the primary with a plurality. He got more votes than anybody else. He had 22% of the votes. His closest competitor was Jake Butcher with 18% of the votes. He was 44 years old. Running on the theme of a ray of Blanton sunshine, the general disarray of the Republican Party, and young Lamar Alexander's blue suit, red tie, and choir boy image, Blanton did almost as well in 1974 as Howard Baker had in 1972, racking up 576,833 votes. And he was so proud of this that he had the state issue a vanity license plate with 576,833 on it. And you put this on the front bumper of your car if you were a loyal Blanton supporter and drove around with it, and they began to diminish as time went on in his term, but I can remember seeing a lot of those. Blanton's election, for all intents and purposes, and certainly in his mind, made him the most prestigious and powerful Democrat in the state. Both the United States senators were Republicans, as was a majority of the congressional delegation. With his prestige, the inherent power of the state's chief executive, and a compliant Democratic legislature, the prospect of Blanton being able to run state government to his liking could not have been rosier. However, the relationship between the governor's office and the legislature had changed while Blanton was in Congress and during the preceding 4 years of a Republican administration. Blanton and his cronies entered office in the misplaced belief that they could control patronage not only statewide, but on the county level too. Because pork and patronage was what governing was all about in Blanton's marred Jacksonian view, he quickly found himself in conflict with the legislature, which now met annually, and its powerful leaders, John Wilder and Ned McWhirter. Blanton, perhaps naively, or as later events would indicate, arrogantly, set the stage for a second and more serious confrontation when he told journalists in his first post-election press conference, "I have always felt that public officials and the press should have an adversarial relationship. Be careful what you wish for, Governor."
All right, there you have it. That's the rise of Ray Blanton. Unfortunately, as you've hinted, John, the rest of the program will probably be devoted to the fall. But before we go past the tipping point, we want to present to you Magistrate Judge Joe Brown, former U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee, who will give us an overview of the entire program and kind of set the table, if you will, for all of these different cases that we'll be talking about as the day goes forward.
I had the fortune or the misfortune to be first assistant U.S. Attorney and later U.S. Attorney from 65 to 91, so I covered most of this area, and it's been interesting going back 35, 40 years to remember. Tennessee has had its share of scandals over the years. The activities of Blanton as governor from January 18 of 1975 to January 17 of 1979 were not the first and probably will not be the last. The Watergate scandals of the Nixon years were concurrent with the early years of this time, and we had a number of problems with sheriffs. At one point, we had 1/3 of the 95 sheriffs either under indictment or investigation for some form of corruption. As you've heard, in 1972, we had the contested election between Blanton and Howard Baker with the Crisco Kid. A more serious issue that would have repercussions later with liquor licenses were illegal campaign contributions to the Blanton Senate campaign, that year by Builders Transportation Company, which was run by Frank Phillips in Memphis. Corporate funds were funneled by Phillips to Blanton campaign through the use of straw contributors. The company and Phillips pled guilty to these charges. Among the straw contributors were Jim Allen and Shorty Freeland, who would become trusted administrative assistants to Blanton, Eddie Shaw, who would become Commissioner of Transportation. Freeland was Blanton's patronage chief. Phillips was appointed to the Alcohol Beverage Commission, which will figure later in the illegal awardings of liquor licenses in April of 1976. Eddie Sisk was active in the campaign as its manager and later had Gene Blanton's full support for appointment as legal counsel, despite little experience with the functions of the office. As John said, Blanton was a firm believer in patronage. Freeland was his go-to man on patronage for all 95 of the county committees that were set up. Anyone wanting a state job or help had to go through the local committee, and for the more important decisions, Freeland. Many people attribute Blanton's troubles to his heavy use of the committees, the rewarding of friends regardless of their qualifications, and his unwillingness to cut them loose when they messed up. Despite his pledge that the family business, the B&B groups, would have no state work, they did. And he further profited from liquor licenses through hidden ownerships and kickback payments. The first real problem for the new administration involved a scandal with the sale of surplus property that you'll hear about more, and the sale of real estate licenses in 1976. G.B. Mccarter, head of the state surplus property in the General Services Administration, was indicted for selling state surplus property to friends of the governor using fake bids and straw purchasers. Eddie Shaw, the Commissioner of Transportation, was indicted for improper purchases of a Ford Bronco through fake bids. Shaw was suspended for a short time, but Blanton restored him to his position before he was later acquitted in a state court trial in December of 1977. Don Harding, the newly appointed director of the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, was arrested May 19, 1976, and later convicted and sentenced to a short jail term in December of 76 for granting real estate licenses in return for $3,000 cash. Allegations of the sale of executive clemency first came up in September of 1976 with information from Marie Reggianti to the FBI through District Attorney Richard Fisher from Chattanooga of possible corruption involving a robbery gang in Chattanooga headed by Tommy Prater. For money, their extradition to Georgia could be and was held up. She also reported an attempt by a man that she thought hung around Eddie Sisk's office as legal counsel in the Capitol named Bill Thompson to get executive clemency for an inmate for $20,000. The inmate's attorney, Jack Lowry, was approached and rejected the offer quickly and was able to have the car stopped by police. The officers identified of the driver, who turned out to be the Chattanooga Prater. This was the start of the pardons and parole investigation by the FBI. Governor Blanton added a lot of fuel to the furor over pardons, paroles, and commutations in 1977 when he defended the placing of Roger Humphries, who was serving 40 years for the double murder of his wife and her lover, on work release as a state photographer. Humphries was the son of the Washington County Patronage Committee chairman. Later, as his term of office was coming to a close, he granted Humphries a full commutation and he was released. Interestingly enough, despite all of these investigations, there was no solid evidence ever produced that the release of Humphries was for money. It was probably a pure case of patronage and a decision by Blanton that as governor, I can do what I want and the press and public be damned. Although the investigations at this point had produced a great deal of evidence of illegal activities with extraditions and clemency, the Department of Justice formally closed the investigation on April 11th of 1978. Thompson, who I mentioned before, and who later pled guilty and cooperated in the investigation, remembered that when the case was closed in 1978, he told Eddie Sisk that they needed to stop as the FBI never gave up. Truer words were never spoken. In late August of 78, the pardons and parole case was reopened with new information on two fronts. In Nashville, Cheryl Leverett, through her attorney, Lionel Barrett, provided information that Dale Quillen was suggesting that for a $10,000 legal fee, he could work with Charlie Benson in Sisk's office to get relief for her husband, who was serving time for armed robbery. Additional Nashville investigations followed, which showed evidence of payments by Ernie Anglin, a Columbia gambler and bookie, to Benson through a longtime Capitol custodian, Arthur Brandon. In Memphis, a topless nightclub operator, Art Baldwin, began cooperating with the FBI. Baldwin was bribing a local ABC agent in Memphis, Ernest Withers, to keep his clubs open. Baldwin was also facing an indictment for serious drug charges, and he needed help big time. Withers' name had come up earlier with an offer to get an inmate named Jerry Cook out for a payment of $15,000. Baldwin, at the direction of the FBI, began to offer bribes to Withers for the release of inmates proposed by the FBI. This led to the involvement of State Highway Patrol Lieutenant Fred Taylor. He was assigned to the governor's security detail and often functioned as Gene Blanton's driver. He was a friend of both Benson and Sisk. The FBI, through Baldwin, paid thousands of dollars to Taylor for promised relief of several hardcore inmates. These inmates were picked because they had bad records and long sentences. None of them knew their names were being used, and none would have ever been released because of the payments by the FBI. These meetings and payments were held in a Memphis motel and were recorded, video and audio, with a camera hidden in the motel TV set. Marked money and lists containing these inmates' names would later be recovered when Sisk, Taylor, and Benson were arrested and searched along with the legal counsel's office in the state capitol in December of 1978. On January 17, 1979, the FBI learned that despite the arrest of these three, actions were still being taken to process clemency for inmates that the FBI had reason to believe had paid money through these co-conspirators. This information led state leaders later that day to approve the swearing in of Governor Alexander 3 days early. The TBI, acting under Governor Alexander's orders, took over the Capitol and stopped Blanton's newly appointed legal counsel from carrying clemency papers for a number of inmates to Blanton's residence later that evening for signature. Sisk, Thompson, Taylor, Benson, Quillen, and J.P. Merle were indicted. Unfortunately for the government, during the course of this investigation, two key witnesses, Anglin, the bookie from Columbia, and Pettyjohn, a fixer from Chattanooga, were killed. Pettyjohn had provided information about a payoff to free a drug dealer in the early parts of the investigation. Their murders are still unsolved. After starts and stops with the trial involving 4 different trial judges, a trip to the Sixth Circuit, Sisk, Thompson, and Taylor would plead guilty. Charges against Merle were dismissed, but he, along with Withers, were convicted of extorting money from Memphis nightclub operators for protection for raids by the state ABC. Charges against Quillen would be dismissed over concerns of whether the government could prove for a RICO conviction the acceptance of 2 separate bribes from Leverett. Benson would be acquitted by a jury trial. The liquor licenses, which had been awarded in 1976, came back in play in 1977, when Metro was allowed to award additional licenses. As evidence would later show, Blanton had ownership interests in a store owned by a road contractor, Jack Ham. Ham would be a key witness in the later prosecution and conviction of Blanton for taking a bribe from Ham for the license. Although Blanton is far better remembered for pardons and parole scandal, his true criminal involvement was in his dealings in and awarding and owning liquor licenses, particularly those that involved 2 of his close friends and aides, Clyde Ed Hood and Jim Allen. The liquor license case would also involve a very lengthy trial, 2 trial judges, more trips to the Sixth Circuit. All 3 were convicted. Due to a subsequent ruling by the Supreme Court in the McNally case redefining mail fraud, only the non-mail fraud counts against Blanton would survive in the end. Blanton, his brother Gene, and Uncle Jake were all involved in the construction and road building business prior to his election as governor. Shaw was the Commissioner of Transportation. Bid rigging was another major scandal of the administration. Bid rigging didn't begin with his administration, and it certainly was not limited to Tennessee, but it reached a high point during his administration. The night before bids would be submitted, the company representatives would meet at the hotel just across from the old Union Station and the federal courthouse to decide who would submit the low bid and who would submit the higher courtesy bids. Led by Richard Braun from the DOJ Antitrust Division, starting with Interstate Pavement and the Tillett brothers, some 60 individuals and companies in Tennessee were indicted. Only Gene and Jake Blanton and B&B Construction Company were convicted by a jury. The other defendants all pled guilty. The state let paving contracts on a monthly basis. Costs, as you might imagine, dropped significantly after the case became public. Among with state officials, a number of county officials also dined at the public trough during this time frame by accepting bribes and payments from various sales representatives for the purchase of goods for their county. Other officials were convicted of extorting money to obtain licenses. Fortunately, the state has since then had a steady succession of governors and administrators that have had far higher ethics and who instituted practices that have brought integrity back to the public, back to the state. Hopefully, we will never have, in such a short time as the Blanton years, so many scandals?
Pardon me, Ray, are you the cat that signs the pardons? Since you're an old friend of mine, just put your name on the line.
Put it on the line.
Double murder and rape, that's all the jury put me in for. And I'm sure you'll agree, they took advantage of me.
Well, there you have it. Pardon me, Ray. And as Joe pointed out, there was never any real evidence adduced that Blanton himself received any money for any of the pardons or commutations that got other people into federal trouble. But it does appear that in the beginning of the Blanton term, the publicity itself is beginning to taint his reputation a little bit. Part of my presentation on the surplus property is almost by necessity a little bit of a personal story. I was 32 years old in the summer of 1976 when I got a call from Nashville lawyer and recent president of the bar, John Hollins Sr., asking me if I would be willing to come and join him and John Wagster in a three-man law firm sharing space on the 8th floor of the Third National Bank building with Jim Neal and Aubrey Harwell. And you would think, knowing what you know now and what I know now, that you would jump at a chance like that, but I was having so much fun working as an assistant district attorney for Tom Shriver that I turned him down. I saw Bob Brandt on the street a day or two later and told him what I'd done, and he pretty much ordered me to go back and call Hollins and tell him I would take the job. I've gotten a lot of career advice from Bob Brandt over the years, but that's probably the best piece of advice I ever got. I did go over there and join John and John in the law firm, and I discovered fairly early that John Hollins had two big cases already in the office that were just sort of simmering, not really hot at that time. One was the case of Jeffrey Womack, who many of you may recognize as the person later charged with the murder of Marcia Trimble. And the other one was a fellow that I had frankly never heard of, but who was a member of the governor's cabinet by the name of Eddie Shaw. Eddie Shaw turned out to be a really nice man in terms of his personality, his hospitality. You really could not have met a more pleasant person. He did have that restaurant down in Shiloh that was famous for its catfish and hush puppies. While we were representing Mr. Shaw, Commissioner Shaw, we were treated to a couple of dove hunts down there where I suspect there was more millet and other seed in the field than there was back in the barn. But nonetheless, we had a lot of fun, and it was very, very pleasant to represent him. But pretty soon, we learned that it was going to be a fight to the finish. And I will say that, at that age, watching John Hollins and learning from him was quite an experience, something that I'll always treasure. I want to tell you a little bit about how he got the job. In 2015, the Tennessee Department of Transportation, formerly the Tennessee Highway Department, celebrated its 100th anniversary. In a special anniversary edition of the Tennessee Road Builder magazine, a member of the Tennessee Road Builders, Eddie Shaw II, explained how his father became commissioner under Governor Ray Blanton in 1975. He explained that at that time his father was in the restaurant business in Shiloh and that he and Governor Blanton were best friends. Ray wanted to be surrounded with his friends in the cabinet, and that's what he did. The only commissioner that position that had not been filled at that point was transportation. So Ray Blanton looked at his friend Eddie and said, "You want it?" And Daddy said, according to Eddie II, "Well, yes, I'll try." He'd had no experience in government or in road building at that point, but because they were friends and because Eddie did have a considerable amount of business background and also had assisted in some of the campaigns, it was a done deal. While Eddie II's father was working in Nashville, the younger Shaw was finishing his education and had purchased a bulldozer. he added one or two more pieces of equipment and started a sand and gravel operation in Adamsville, Tennessee, where he was soon joined after the administration by Eddie Sr., and upon the election of Lamar Alexander, they both became road builders, although Eddie himself was never caught up formally in the bid rigging that Joe Brown described a moment ago. While we're looking at the welcome sign to Adamsville, let's get a viewpoint of what Adamsville was like from one of the main characters in our story today, Mr. Eddie Sisk.
Eddie Shaw was one of the, what they used to call the Adamsville Mafia. There were 7 or 8 guys that had been with Blanton ever since he ran for the House, and then ran for Congress, and then the Senate, and then the governor's office. That always showed up everywhere, and it showed up at functions, and we're always there to support him. And he always, of course, felt all along that Eddie was totally innocent of everything. I was a liaison with the Attorney General's office. I was his legislative liaison, and I was his personal advisor on legal matters.
Adamsville Mafia, that's not a term that I would have wanted someone to use in describing my client while he was on trial for defrauding the state. I'm thankful that neither Dave Rabin or Roger May, who prosecuted that case, thought to do that. Maybe they weren't aware of that nickname. Many people have surmised, although I don't know that you could ever prove a thing like this, that one of the problems that confounded the Blanton administration was that Governor Dunn, I believe his picture was up there, had been a Republican, of course, from Memphis, and when he was elected, that was the first time since 1923 that Tennessee had had a Republican governor. In 1923, good old Alf here was the governor, and one of many Taylors who filled that office. And the speculation is, for what it's worth, that with that 4-year break in Democratic patronage, that there was a little bit of pent-up demand, if you will, for the services of Shorty Freeland. Now, I've bounced that off a few of my good Democratic friends, and none of them have completely owned up to it. But some of them didn't deny it either, so I decided to leave it in the program. The problem was that when Governor Blanton went into office, much like the description of his hiring, if you will, of his friend Eddie Shaw, he put people in positions of government with a fair amount of power who had not really exercised that kind of power in the past, and particularly had not done it with the idea of the public good being the primary goal. One such person was a fellow named Sonny Mccarter. We're going to get to him in a minute. But in October of 1976, the 22nd of October actually, Eddie Shaw was indicted in Davidson County. That's a newspaper article about the later re-indictment of him, but that was a shock that sent shock waves across the state of Tennessee. And from that day all the way through to December of the following year, there was virtual daily publicity in the newspapers, radio, and TV stations across the state of Tennessee about the indictment and upcoming trial of Transportation Commissioner Eddie Shaw. Now, at the center of this was this fellow named Sonny Mccarter. I would say that Mccarter, even though he was later going to plead guilty and be placed on probation, was not really that much of a criminal in the usual sense. He probably just didn't fully understand that what he was doing would be illegal, because what he was doing was he'd been placed pretty much on Gene Blanton's recommendation in a position in the General Services Department where he was allowed to take surplus vehicles, mostly vehicles, other equipment occasionally, but mostly vehicles, and just call up his buddy, Paul Hively in Selmer or Roberts down in Pulaski, and say, hey, I got 2 Chevrolets, I got a Ford truck, I got this, I got that, what do you give me for them? And they'd say, well, here's my pal Sonny Mccarter, I'm gonna quote him about half market value, and he'll take it. And he did. And little by little, the word got out that this was possible. And when the agents went to talk to Sonny Mccarter for the first time, and these were TBI at that time, federal government was not involved in the Shaw prosecution, Mccarter was fairly candid with them and just said, yeah, I did that and did this. And later, when he realized that what he was telling them was about to get him in serious trouble, he had the wisdom to hire the aforementioned James F. Neal, famous Watergate prosecutor, to represent him in what was going to obviously be a pretty serious criminal case coming up. Neal was right in the middle of some other heavy stuff at that time. And so I don't know how much time he spent on it, but he cut a really good deal for Mccarter, I have to say that. He went in very quickly, and I'm sure dealt with his classmate Tom Shriver, my former boss, and basically said, look, Mccarter has done this, but you don't want Mccarter. Mccarter's just a used car man. You want Eddie Shaw, because he's the governor's best friend, and he's a member of the cabinet. And Shriver and his assistants looked at that and said, hey, I think you're right. And the problem with that, and I don't know that they would agree that it was a problem, but looking back on it, I would say, and as a former prosecutor, I would say it probably was. What they were doing is they were plea bargaining downstream a little bit. Even though they were going to charge a much more important figure, he had much less involvement. The Department of Transportation had nothing to do with surplus property. General Services did that. So the deal was made with Mccarter, who was admittedly guilty, to prosecute Shaw, who denied guilt. And that turned out to be a problem later on. All right, let's look at what Mccarter did. The work of Neal was fairly quick and fairly effective. And you'll see that as we go through the next slide or two, that they did make a deal with Mccarter to get the bigger fish, Eddie Shaw. And the deal was basically that he would plead guilty, take 2 years probation. And that was across the board. That was for all the places in Tennessee that he was charged. And as I say, it's never a good idea to plea bargain downward. Now, my partner was John Hollins Sr., and John had probably gotten the case from Jim Neal. I think Jim Sanders is here. He'd probably back me up on that. But however he got it, he had it when I arrived, and the very first thing I was assigned to do was to prepare motions to dismiss the indictments based on the principle that even though these vehicles clearly were transferred, there was no Tennessee law that required the state to get bids or to have auctions. And whether or not it was too good a deal to be criminal was a matter of subjective judgment, in which, as it turned out, a jury was not willing to make that judgment. Now, I said that part of this story was personal, and I still remember the night, October 22nd, 1976, when the indictment came down, because I'd only been over at the Hollins office for about 2 months and was still kind of, wide-eyed, looking around, watching Jim Neal come up and down the hall, so on and so forth. He'd been my former teacher at Vanderbilt Law School. And I was really enthralled with all this, and Hollins calls me into his office and says, Eddie Shaw's been indicted, we've got to go to the governor's residence. Okay, let's go, And so we get in the car and we go out there, fully expecting that there would be the governor and probably a couple of members of his staff and, who knows what going on, very important place, very important events. We got there, we went back into the little study over to the right of the main door, and there sitting in a chair, virtually immobile, was Ray Blanton, who I recognized from the news clips, and John Siegenthaler. Now, I knew John Siegenthaler. I knew who he was. He was editor of the Tennessean. And I said, well, wait a minute. We're here to talk about the defense of Eddie Shaw, and there's going to be a newspaper reporter sitting here? What's this all about? And that's when I first learned about the many hats of John Siegenthaler. John Siegenthaler was a confidential advisor to Governor Ray Blanton on practically everything he did. Couldn't control him, as it turns out, but he did advise him. And he was there to be the eyes and ears as we explained to the governor what we were going to do to represent his best friend in these criminal charges. It was quite an event for me. I later figured out when I got to know Siegenthaler better that he was really good at keeping a secret. The first thing that happened after that was another indictment, and that was in Chattanooga. Down in Chattanooga, they had a young DA named Gary Gerbitz and an assistant named Stan the Man Lonzo, some call him the Italian Stallion, and he was a really good trial lawyer, and they indicted Eddie and McCarter and two or three of the car dealers on a multiple count indictment, and we had to go down there for arraignment and then to set a trial, and this is when the motions to dismiss began flying. And I found out something as a young lawyer, in filing motions to dismiss the indictment. Basically, all you're doing is teaching the government how to indict your client. Because in both jurisdictions, they re-indicted and tried to clean up all the mess that I was trying to point out in my motion to dismiss. So, if you're aware of that, you might want to think twice before you tell them how to do it, even though it didn't work. So we went down to Chattanooga and met these fine lawyers down there and realized that they were serious. And they set their trial in April. And Judge DeRizio, who was a fine judge, gave us a 1-month continuance, and it was set for trial on May the 17th, 1976. So we had to go down there and spend several days in the hotel and getting ready and so on and so forth. And we realized the night before the trial, they really didn't have a case. They had a lot of smoke, but they didn't have the smoking gun, as we say today. And we had led Gerbitz to believe that there was a possibility of some settlement, but when we came to the conclusion that we could win that case, we called him up that night and told him, sorry, we have to go to trial in the morning. And there was great disappointment at the other end of that telephone line. We got to court that morning, and General Gerbitz came up and told Judge DeRizio that the state was going to annihilate the case. And all defendants were dismissed that morning. We drove back to Nashville. It was a beautiful, sunshiny day. We got back to town, and on the streets, the corner of 4th and Church, where our office was, there was already a Nashville banner showing that the child charges in Chattanooga had been dropped. Big stuff for a 30-something kid, right? Well, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves, but that didn't last long. The Nashville people did supersede their indictment. They cleaned up a lot of the problems with the earlier indictment. And so we go to the picture of the various participants in the Nashville trial, including, that's more Chattanooga. Over there on the right side, you'll see a very youthful shot of Roger May, the Artful Dodger, and Mr. Rabin. You'll see more of those later. This is an opportunity, by the way, for us to show you our press clippings. And if you think mine are bad, well, you see Rabin's. But Judge Draper down there was quite a character. Most of you, the younger folks, won't know who that is. He had been a judge since 1925. It was a little crusty, but real fair, and gave you a good trial. And to his credit, after the case was over, our client had sent country hams to all the members of the jury and to Judge Draper. Judge Draper sent his back. So that's the kind of guy he was. Probably got to move a little quicker now. A few minutes. This picture about the beginning of the trial shows Roger there on the left and Charles Lee. Charles Lee was the lead investigator for the TBI who had investigated Eddie Shaw. And almost before this trial was over, he decided to go to law school, got a law degree, and became a circuit judge down in Bedford County, Tennessee, or Lynchburg, or somewhere down in that district, and had a really fine career on the bench. So a lot of careers were started, not too many ended, thankfully, by the Shaw trial. We'll go on through them, Jody. The car deals and so on and so forth were talked about during the trial. Hively and Roberts testified about the bargains that they were getting from the state of Tennessee. We were obviously concerned about the bias against Blanton creeping into the jury room. We decided that we would call some character witnesses. You can't do as much of that today as we could back then. Some of our character witnesses included Sheriff Fate Thomas, Commissioner of Human Services Horace Bass, Jane Ann Woods, Commissioner of Revenue, Paul Summers, the father of the former Attorney General. He was on the Court of Appeals at that time, but there was no restriction on judges being character witnesses, so he came in and testified for his good friend Eddie Shaw. Now, preparation is a great thing, and I joke with my pal here, Ed Lanquist. You know, two Eds are better than one, right? So Lanquist and I, are kind of in charge of this, I guess. Blame us, but sometimes you think of things while you're on your feet. And this little quote that made it into the Chattanooga Times and also the Nashville newspaper literally came to me as I was in the middle of my closing argument that day. I asked the jury if they would buy a used car from Sonny Mccarter. The reason being that the only real proof that Eddie Shaw had done anything illegal was the testimony of Sonny Mccarter. And so I asked, would you buy a used car from him? And that phrase was a little more popular then than it is now. But the jury laughed. And then I said, would you buy a conviction from him? Because basically that's what the state was selling. And the answer to that clearly was no. It was a lot of fun that night, Saturday, December 10, 1977, to celebrate with Big John and John Wagster, who came over and picked us up. I think it was raining a little bit. I celebrated a little too much, so I didn't go home till the following morning. But as I was driving home on a bright Sunday morning, I noticed that lying in the driveways of most of the residents of Nashville, you got to remember this is 40 years ago, were these newspapers with that headline, Shaw found not guilty. Now, again, being personal, at age 33, that's pretty heavy stuff. And it was a lot of fun to be a law partner with a guy like John Hollins. We also had a happy client. Eddie went back to work on the following Monday. They took his picture, talking on the phone, tended to state business, I guess. Not everybody was happy. Larry Brenton and some other folks at the Nashville Banner had an editorial in the paper that morning that asked the rhetorical question whether anybody would go to jail for what was obviously the crooked disposition of state surplus vehicles. And the answer to that question was no. Thank you. Now, that was a little bit of a setback, but now we come to a very different story, one that you've already heard a little bit about. The title of this one is Pardon Me, Ray, but actually it's about a number of other people, and it's being presented today by Mr. Bill Cohen, former Assistant United States Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee, and his partner in crime over there, David Rabin, formerly the prosecutor of Eddie Shaw, but now Professor Rabin, giving you all the details of how he single-handedly brought down the pardon and parole scandal.
And Mr. Shaw did not give us hams, neither Roger May nor I received one. Bill Cohen and I are going to talk about the pardon and parole matter. We'll do it in 4 parts. This first section will discuss how this controversy began. It's best remembered for the sins of Blanton administration is the pardon and parole. This first section will discuss how the controversy began. This is a picture of the state penitentiary and the old walls, as they call it. And our Constitution allows the governor the power of clemency authority, which is the federal Constitution does. In Tennessee, pardons or commutations, a pardon absolves you of your sins ostensibly, and commutations, which you'll hear a lot about, is a reduction in sentence. These methods were the historical manner by which prisoners were released from the penitentiary. This is so because parole and probation did not even exist in the early 20th century, and it was, even then, it was very restrictive. So the governor was the one that had to release people from long sentences. We now move to 1975. We come to the administration of Ray Blanton, and this is a satirical pardon application, which I have in the Rabin archives. As noted, clemency was certainly a normal and accepted practice in those days. In all administrations it was. And this was particularly so because our prisons at that time were seriously overcrowded, and the jury, not the judge, imposed the sentence, and they were astronomical. The source of the Clemency Scandal: Blanton set up these patronage committees that you've already heard about. And one of the things that the patronage committees would do would not only get jobs for prisoners, but would also get prisoners out of prison. And then it didn't take long for them to figure that they could charge for this. And so the go-to guy in the governor's office for pardons was Eddie Sisk and others. Clemency, however, even though the governor could grant clemency, the Pardon and Parole Board was charged with the duty of vetting these things. And so the Pardon and Parole Board was used as a cover to vet pardons which were purchased. A favorable recommendation from the Pardon Board would be a guaranteed cover and a favorable pardon by the governor. The governor needed a compliant person to do this. Enter Marie Regenti. Eddie Sisk got Marie her job as an extradition administrator. When there was an opening on the parole board, she became the chair of the parole board. She is appointed chair. She was 34 years old, a single mom of several children, and had just taken her bachelor's degree at Vanderbilt. And this is Marie, and that's her daughter, and Blanton is announcing her appointment. Now we see the idea, the next slide would be, Marie Regenti, very shortly after she got there, believes herself to be pressured to recommend clemency when it was not appropriate. She believed that cash might be changing hands for clemency. So in September of 1976, and she got some information from some other people about some problems with extraditions, but she finally figures out that there's a problems with clemency, so she needs to talk to somebody that she can trust and confide in, and she goes to the youngest member of the State Attorney General's office, and there's this kid who's assigned representation of the parole board, and that's his job. And in walks Marie Regenti to this young man. That would be me. And she tells me for the first time that not only there's this problem that Jack Larry's telling about, but this thing reaches straight up into the governor's office himself, and particularly Eddie Sisk. I had also received some independent corroboration from this from other sources. And so what I did was I contacted Richard Fisher, the district attorney in East Tennessee. And Fisher contacts again, he had already spoken to the FBI, but now the U.S. Attorney's Office in Nashville is involved in this. They issue subpoenas for 368 pardon files. And these subpoenas are issued, and this creates great consternation. And Blanton starts screaming, all of a sudden, this is political. And for reasons that I will never understand, the U.S. Attorney, Anderson, outs me and says, I'm one of the sources for this. Sisk comes to my boss, and I'm at risk of being fired for this because I've done this. And so the sources of this subpoenas are now divulged. Only my name is used. This causes a lot of problems. It didn't take long. They figured out Marie was involved in this. And as Bill Cohen will tell you later, she refused to wear a wire when she was later part of this investigation. I imagine that she had a great fear of the federal government at that point because they did not give her the cover that she thought she was going to have, because I got outed very soon after this. This next slide is a picture of Marie Regenti, which I got off the Tennessean website 2 days ago. They had that retrospective in that. And there's Marie on the right. That's Charles Trauber. He was the only one that spoke at the press conference. Marie had nothing to say. She was aghast that her name had been brought up as one of the three sources, three Democrats that had given this the information to the U.S. Attorney, which to this day I don't understand why. But in any event, that was part of the problem, and that's a press conference from almost exactly 40 years ago. Marie stays on as the chair of the parole board. There's a very strained relationship between she and Sisk and Blanton over the next year. Finally, the governor had had enough and he fires her. She then hires an attorney, Fred Thompson, yes, that Fred Thompson, to be her lawyer. And there's a lawsuit against it. She has a case, I believe, in Chancellor High's court, and she wins the lawsuit and gets ostensibly reinstated, her back pay, but basically she is vindicated. This is such a famous story. This is really the literal beginning of the parole thing. This is such a famous story that they made a movie out of Marie Rajani's situation, and that is Fred Thompson playing himself in the movie. That's how he got his start in Hollywood, for those of you who don't know that, if you go back. This is Sissy Spacek, who plays Marie Rajani. That's the fellow that played the governor. Jeff Daniels plays Eddie Sisk in the movie. And now we're going to show you a clip from the movie.
Evil flourishes when good men do nothing.
Criminals went free.
What are y'all wasting my time for? I'll be out tomorrow.
Officials were bribed.
There are rumors that pardons can be bought.
Witnesses were threatened. The FBI couldn't stop it.
They're talking about dropping the investigation.
But one woman had the courage to try.
You are a troublemaker.
That is a lie.
Larkin Bibbs, second-degree murder. Christmas clemency, Clayton Dawson. Death penalty, commuted to life.
And we want a hearing scheduled right quick. That boy's daddy was a big contributor.
He told me this clemency would be successful if I gave him $20,000.
That's extortion.
No money has changed hands.
You're never gonna get away with this.
Now, who the hell started this? Well, I think it's Marie. It's your mouth I'm talking about.
If I were you, I'd spend more time thinking about the future.
I will not resign.
Do you think we're in danger, Fred?
Marie, they're gonna smear you with everything they can.
Somebody has to stand up to them, Fred.
In 1978, in the state of Tennessee, the criminal justice system was put on trial. It placed the power of the government against the word of one woman. Marie. Sissy Spacek, in an explosive true story.
Now, you saw in that movie where a guy's getting attacked and the police find a body and everything. Ken Lavender, who was a parole official at the time, was murdered while this case was going on. And many people thought that that was Blanton's henchman had killed him. And I had talked about that. I was in the book about Marie. But then I ended up prosecuting the two guys that killed Ken Lavender. Had nothing to do with Blanton. And Peter Moss, the author, accused me of selling out to Blanton and wrote me out of the movie. Anyway, so the question then comes up, was Marie fact or fiction? And there's Fred and Sissy Spacek looking at Marie Rajani. And so that question is it fact or fiction? The Nashville News ran a story that this was, in fact, a giant fairy tale. But there's a book, and then Ms. Magazine wrote an article written by Gloria Steineman about how she stopped the redneck mafia single-handedly. This is Marie Rajani speaking at Fred Thompson's funeral last year. She went on to earn a master's degree from Vanderbilt and Harvard and eventually served on the Parole Commission. And now Bill Cohen will pick up the story from there.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Cohen, and I had the privilege as a very, very young lawyer to become involved in the pardons and paroles prosecution. The Nashville FBI office opened an investigation based upon the information Marie Rajani had provided. What was the statutory basis? What crime was involved? Well, it was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization statute. Enacted by Congress in 1970, primarily aimed at organized crime, La Cosa Nostra. Prosecutors were beginning to use RICO, however, in political corruption cases at the time of this investigation. RICO is a very complicated statute. It's page after page. But basically, it requires proof of a pattern of racketeering activities. And a pattern of racketeering activities is 2 or more acts of racketeering. So 2 murders, 2 drug sales, 1 murder, 1 drug sale. But you have to have 2. Racketeering is defined as including bribery and extortion against state or federal law. And the defendants in a RICO case such as this one must be part of an enterprise, an association, a partnership, or a legal entity. Upon receipt of the information about Marie Rajanti, the FBI did the logical thing and interviewed Marie Rajanti. And she told them about some suspicious cases. One involved Tommy Prater and the extradition to Georgia. Another involved Bill Thompson going to Jack Lowry's office and saying he could get executive clemency for Lowry's client for 20 grand. She also talked about the early releases of a man named Larkin Bibbs, who was the drug dealer from Chattanooga that was involved with Sam Pettyjohn, who Joe said was murdered, and a man named Bill Cole, who was serving a sentence for armed robbery. The FBI asked Marie Rajanti to wear a tape recorder to record her conversations with Eddie Sisk, and she declined. She was later asked again to do that, and she again declined. The FBI began conducting a covert investigation based upon what Marie Rajanti said, but very quickly the decision was made to go public because information was received that clemency files in Eddie Sisk's office were being cleaned out. Subpoenas were issued and served upon the legal counsel's office, and records were obtained pursuant to those subpoenas. Governor Blanton was not happy and fired back and requested that the Department of Justice investigate the Nashville U.S. Attorney's Office, which was supervising the investigation. The investigation continued. Eventually, Tommy Prater flipped, as did Bill Cole. They began cooperating with the government. Both Prater and Cole said that money had been paid to get inmates released from prison. Prater admitted to driving Bill Thompson to Jack Lowry's office. Bill Cole admitted that after he was released from prison, he went back into the prison and solicited his fellow inmates to pay money to get their releases. Both men implicated Thompson in the scheme, and Prater implicated Eddie Sisk. Investigation continues. Other individuals are interviewed and confirmed that payments of money were being made to get or attempt to get inmates released from prison. United States attorneys are typically replaced when there's a change of administration, and stay tuned, that's going to happen. At the request of U.S. Attorney Charles Anderson, who was then in the process of being replaced by Hal Hardin as U.S. Attorney, the investigation was transferred to the Public Integrity Section of the Department of Justice, who assigned 2 prosecutors to continue the federal probe. And the investigation then took off and went on for a number of months. Neither Eddie Sisk nor Ray Blanton took the investigation lying down. Eddie Sisk claimed that he was the target of persecution. And in September 1977, Governor Blanton called then United States Attorney General Griffin Bell to talk about the federal grand jury probe. A document entitled Questions for Bell was later found in Eddie Sisk's desk. In April 1978, the investigation was closed by the Public Integrity Section based upon concerns they had about the strength of the government's proof. The closure of the investigation was made public. Thereafter, the Tennessean published an editorial which was every prosecutor's dream, entitled, Was Jury Probe Worth Cost? I wasn't in the office then. However, as was mentioned before, the investigation was renewed after Arthur Baldwin began cooperating and paying Highway Patrol Lieutenant Fred Taylor to secure the release of inmates. In addition to recording the conversations between Baldwin and Taylor, recordings were made of Taylor's side of telephone conversations with Charles Benson, the extradition officer who worked in Eddie Sisk's office, and who was Taylor's contact in that office. Surveillance was also conducted by the FBI of Benson and Taylor. Also helping to revive the investigation was Cheryl Leverett, who was trying to get her husband John released from prison. Leverett had a series of recorded conversations with attorney Dale Quillen and Charles Benson about getting John released through the guise of a legal fee in the amount of $10,000, a portion of which was paid to Quillen. Quillen promised to return the fee if John wasn't released. Cheryl Leverett and Charles Benson had a conversation in the state capitol building, and during the conversation, Charles Benson searched Cheryl Leverett rather thoroughly to see if she was wearing a recorder. She was, but fortunately he did not discover it, as she had moved it to her underpants. The investigation continued, and more individuals admitted to having paid money to secure or attempt to secure the release of inmates. The investigation culminated in the December 15, 1978 searches of Sisk's office in the Capitol building, and the Office of Pardons and Paroles were also searched.
Just before 6 tonight, Sisk and Benson were formally charged before a U.S. magistrate in Nashville, and Taylor was arraigned in Memphis. Bond was set at $50,000 each, and a preliminary hearing is scheduled for next Friday. By 7:15 tonight, about 4 hours after they arrived, FBI agents had apparently gotten what they came for. In all, about 20 boxes of records were taken from Capitol building offices, records that presumably will support the charges of racketeering and bribery against Eddie Sisk, Charles Benson, and Charles Taylor. Jim Fulbright, Channel 4 News.
Fred Taylor was arrested in Memphis on December 15, 1978, after he received a payoff of $6,000 from Arthur Baldwin. Charles Benson was arrested at the Nashville airport, where he had gone to fly to Memphis to bring commutation papers to Taylor for 3 prisoners Art Baldwin had paid Taylor to have released. Benson had the commutation papers with him, as well as $33,000 in cash that Baldwin had paid to Taylor 2 days before. Sisk was arrested in his office. He had $12,000 in cash that Baldwin had paid to Taylor 2 days before. And now I'll turn it back over to David.
And Bill reminded me, I misspoke. It wasn't Ken Lavender who was killed. It was Kevin McCormick. Lavender was the governor's appointment secretary. Now we're going to talk about how the pardon scandal ended. And there, of course, is Ray Blanton. On the left side of this next slide, you will see Blanton being sworn in, and there's Lamar Alexander. As was told to you, Blanton never got a penny, in my view, for any of this, any of the pardon aspects of this. In my view, this was nothing more than sheer arrogance of power. By mid-1977, there are a multitude of controversies. The legislature overrides Blanton's veto of the death penalty, which was very unpopular action on his part. By now, he's issued over 600 clemency releases amid allegations that clemency is for sale. Enter Roger Humphries, John Roger Humphries. Humphries is convicted in 1975 of killing his former wife and her male friend. He'd fired 18 shots. He went in with a two-shot Derringer, and then he reloaded the gun 8 times and killed them both, and convicted of murder, sentenced to 40 years. He's the son of the political patronage chief, however. We find that after only 2 months in prison, Humphries is working as a prison photographer for 2 years while on work release and trustee status. He visits his new wife, he has a new wife, at her apartment. He drives a state-owned car, and he's Betty Blanton's photographer at the governor's mansion. In September of 1977, Lee Smith, publisher of the Tennessee Journal, which is also Tennessee Attorney's Memo, breaks the story about Humphries. He recognizes him because they're both from East Tennessee. It is immediate, and he breaks the story, and it's immediately seen as political favoritism for a double murder at its worst. This causes a media firestorm of the first order. And so Blanton, he says, I'm going to go on TV, I'm going to explain this. So he goes on Channel 4, Carol Maureen, who excellent journalist, wants to interview him live for 15 minutes. And he says in the middle of this interview, explaining why Roger Humphries is on work release and running around after only 2 months, he says, why? He says, I've not sold a single pardon. And then he says, I'm going to announce to you now, before I go out of office, that I'm going to pardon him. Totally unsolicited, beyond the scope of the questions. This just is an outrageous thing. And for your pleasure, we now have an excerpt of that video.
We're taking this section of the Scene at 6 to have a live interview with Governor Ray Blanton about the Corrections Department, amongst other topics. Thank you for coming, Governor.
It's a pleasure.
First and foremost, the case of Roger Humphries, serving 20 to 40 years for murder. Total time that he has spent in jail and in prison, less than 2 years.
Wrong. He spent 2 years incarcerated in the state prison system. He spent almost 2 years in the county jail before he came here. So let's don't confuse the facts. Just stick with the facts and we'll be all right.
Some of your critics, both Republican and some Democrat, say politics was the reason for Roger Humphries' reclassification.
Politics is government. Everything I do is political because politics means government. Now, I wasn't aware of Roger Humphries' acumen. I didn't know that he was that good a photographer until after he'd been in my office for some 2 years.
What I'm asking you is, has politics given Roger Humphries an edge that another murderer, another person set up, who might still be behind the wall, that person wouldn't have?
Roger Humphries' own conduct gave him the edge. And everything I do is political. Period.
Then correction? Your input in correction?
In my conduct in office, I'm an elected politician. I have the authority. I have the trust of the people that elected me, and it's all part of the political process.
Again, the question of equity with other prisoners who may not have the political connections that Roger Humphries has.
The question is my judgment, vested in me, under the Constitution of the state of Tennessee, the people that work for me, is that he merited this. And I'm going to announce to you now that before I go out of office, he's going to be pardoned.
Can you explain that decision, Governor?
Very simply. I feel like he merited. You see, in a crime of passion, a crime of murder, which Miss Blanton and I request whenever we have these inmates working for us out at the residence that are around our children and our lives, we request murderers for one very simple reason. They're rarely repetitious.
His file did not reflect photographic skill. And the question is, how was the decision made, and wasn't it made out of cronyism, perhaps, because there was very little other information?
Cronyism. If you'll notice, the only people that have raised this outside of your station is Republicans. That's politics. That's not cronyism.
But you yourself say you're engaged in politics?
I haven't sold a single pardon, a single parole, or none of my people have.
I'm talking about selling a parole or a pardon.
But look at the people that have jumped up and raised this issue. I know that your Mr. Kettering is from Louisiana. I know that he was there while my Commissioner of Corrections was there. What kind of vendetta that he has against one of the best commissioners there is in the state of Tennessee or in the nation, I don't know. But some of these days he's going to have to answer to it because you are a licensed of the FCC.
Are you threatening
and
our
there's a good
Governor?
question of whether you ought to have your license renewed or not because of your biased reporting under the guise of news and not having enough guts to come out and editorialize. Now, if you want to editorialize, why not do it?
Governor, we're interviewing you, asking you the facts instead. Rather than opinion, we're asking our chief executive.
I'm talking about what you've done in the past. I'm not tonight.
Are you basically saying then that you don't have to explain Roger Humphries, that you will pardon him because you are chief?
I have explained Roger Humphries.
But not...
What else do you want to know? Ask me a question. Don't make a statement.
The question I've been asking, Governor, all through the interview, on what information was Roger Humphries first released at a minimum security 2 months after he went behind the main wall.
Let me explain it to you simple enough where you can understand it. Vocational aptitude, ability, trustworthiness, and the fact that he's performed. Now, can you understand that?
In politics?
No. You asked me why. I've just given you 4 reasons why. You want 10 more?
Thank you very much for being with us, Governor Blanton. We will return with more of the Scene at 6 in just a moment.
I want to add to you, through the good offices of the Nashville Bar Association, the full interview is on the NBA website today under the news section. As you can imagine, your reaction to this was what the public reacted. Over the next year, this causes just an astounding media firestorm. And now we come to December of 1978, when 3 things come together within the space of 8 days. On December the 15th, 78, as you've heard, Sis, Benson, and Taylor are arrested. On December the 19th, the Chancery Court injunction hearing to block future pardons occurs, which I'll tell you about in a second. And then on the 22nd, Blanton himself is called before the federal grand jury in Nashville. Now I want to talk about the Chancery Court injunction to block future clemencies. I find myself back into this thing all of a sudden. Shriver and I are now in Chancery Court in front of Chancellor Brandt, asking the Chancellor to block any future pardons and invalidate the last 600 pardons that he's granted. Why? Because we have discovered that Governor Blanton hadn't signed a single one. He had given Eddie Siska's power of attorney, and Ken Lavender was using a signature machine to crank these things out. And so we proved all this at the hearing, and the next day, Chancellor Brandt renders his decision. And before we get to the decision, this is the headline of when we're arguing. That's the next morning, but this is the argument. And John J. Hooker, who is the relator, stands up and asks Brandt to be the governor over this, and Chancellor Brandt respectfully declines. But there's Shriver on the left, there's John J. Hooker, there's Bill Leach, there's me at the top right, and Blanton on the lower right while we're arguing about this. But you'll notice in the right-hand column, and I kept this, because Sisk et al. Had just been arrested and didn't have all the $100 bills accounted for, the FBI is now asking the banks to look for the $100 bills that is missing left from the marked money. This is all going on at the same time. This is amazing. The next day, Chancellor Brandt issues his ruling. A brave decision by a very good judge. He invalidates, he said, Governor has unlawfully delegated the power to grant pardons and reprieves. No pardon has been granted unless the governor has personally approved this. The next day, Shriver and I hold a press conference. We're going to get a net, and we're going to round up all 600 of these folks and bring them back. And this has now caused wild speculation about whether we can gather up all 600 of these prisoners. The very next day, Blanton appears in front of the federal grand jury, and there's Jim Neal, now representing Governor Blanton, and Aubrey Harwell's behind him. And they're coming out of the grand jury, and as he's coming out, we've just had this decision of Chancellor Brandt, and Blanton says, not to worry, all you folks who I've granted clemency to, you'll have a happy Christmas because I'm going to reissue all 600 of them. That just drove the public wild, but Blanton had one more bullet in his gun, one more ace up his sleeve. On January the 15th, just a few days before he's to leave our office, he grants a commutation, which people call a pardon, to Roger Humphries. And then this is a famous quote from the Gentry Crowell, Secretary of State. Blanton says, you know, this takes guts, as he's signing this. And Crowell says, well, some people have more guts than brains.
In one of his last acts as governor of Tennessee, Ray Blanton, a target of a federal investigation of an alleged parole-selling scheme, has cut the sentences of a number of murderers and other convicts. Bruce Hall has the details.
The FBI has filed affidavits with a federal grand jury saying that Governor Ray Blanton either had knowledge of or participated in a scheme in the governor's office to sell pardons to state prisoners. Last month, 3 of Blanton's aides were indicted in the parole for pay scandal. With only 4 days left in office, Blanton stunned the state with a middle-of-the-night announcement that he had granted executive clemency to another 52 prisoners, including 26 murderers. And he says he is not through yet.
I don't want to discuss cases with you. They'll be on record and they'll be on file, and there'll be some more.
So far, Blanton has released more than 650 prisoners during a stormy 4-year term. Incoming Governor Lamar Alexander called the pardon sickening and said Blanton's latest actions were a disgrace to the office.
It was disgraceful to the office of governor and contemptuous to the people of the state.
The most controversial of the latest group of prisoners to be freed is Roger Humphries, the son of a former Blanton patronage chief. Earlier, Blanton had given Humphries a job as a state photographer after serving only 2 months in prison for the brutal slaying of his former wife and her boyfriend. The governor's order specified that there would be no parole supervision or restrictions on most of the cases, including Humphries. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Nashville.
And of course, right after this, the U.S. Attorney, as you'll hear of later, finds out that there's going to be more commutations issued, and he tells the government that some of these people who are going to be released are actually have paid money to be released. And so Lamar Alexander, to stop this, is sworn in 3 days early, effectively ousting Blanton from office. Now, what is the effect of this, a long-term effect? This is an article my son, Ben Rabin, wrote about, pardon me, just last month, about the effects of pardons in Tennessee. And Blanton issued over 650 clemencies, Bredesen 29, and those only on the last day of office. And our current governor, who's been in office for 1.5 terms, 0. And so the clemency has gone down to about none. As a postscript to this, my investigator advised me that following his release from prison, John Rudger Humphries lived in Franklin under his less famous first name. He died on June the 4th, 2008, at age 61, and was quietly buried. It's an accident of history that I was involved at the beginning of this, somewhat in the middle, and literally at its end. And I stand by my view that Blanton exhibited raw abuse of power at its worst. And I'm glad that our system of checks and balances functioned, because there were good people who did what their oaths of office dictated that they should. And Bill Cohen will now finish the rest of the story. Thank you.
The federal investigation continued after the aftermath of the events of December 15th, which included going through a mountain of evidence and documents seized during the searches and bringing numerous witnesses before the grand jury, including Governor Ray Blanton, as you've already seen. In March of 1979, an indictment was returned charging Sisk, Benson, Taylor, Thompson, Quillen, and J.P. Morrell with conspiracy to violate RICO and a violation of RICO. Morrell was from Memphis and was alleged to have taken money to help arrange the release of inmates. It was a 49-page indictment. The indictment alleged the payment of money to obtain or attempt to obtain the release of 24 named inmates, including those I've talked about earlier, and to block the extradition of Prater and the other 3 men to Georgia. The indictment alleged that the office of the governor of the state of Tennessee was the enterprise for RICO purposes, which was unprecedented at this time, but alleged after consultation with G. Robert Blakely, a law professor who had written the RICO statute when he was chief counsel to a Senate subcommittee. Blanton was not charged, and no charges were brought concerning Roger Humphries because, as you've heard, there was no evidence to support such charges. The case was assigned to Nashville Chief District Judge L. Clore Morton. A motion was filed by Cecil Branstetter, Sisk's attorney, to recuse Judge Morton. The grounds asserted for recusal included the facts that Judge Morton was a Republican and that he had supported Howard Baker, against whom Ray Blanton had run for the sentence. Judge Morton rejected the grounds asserted for recusal, but recused himself anyway. In his opinion accompanying his order recusing himself, Judge Morton noted that Judge Thomas Wiseman, who was the other district judge in Nashville at that time, agreed that the case should be tried by a judge outside the Middle District of Tennessee. And Judge Charles Neese from the Eastern District of Tennessee was appointed to be the trial judge. As we were to learn, Judge Neese had some peculiar way of doing things. About a week before jury selection, Judge Neese announced that it was his practice that all the witnesses had to be brought in before the jury so the jury could take a look at them and see what they looked like and if they knew them. The government had approximately 140 witnesses. Guess who had to bring 140 witnesses to Nashville? The young guy, me. And it was a nightmare because we had FBI agents from all over the nation. In addition, if there were any witnesses we could not bring to jury selection, I had to get their personal data and stand up and read in front of the jury their name, their age, where they lived, what they did, and give a physical description of them. Now, the rule applied to the prosecution and the defense, but shockingly, no defense witnesses were ever displayed to the jury. Either the defendants did not know if they were calling witnesses, didn't know the names of the witnesses they'd be calling, or you can fill in the blank. Judge Neese also did not allow us to give an opening statement. Our opening statement consisted of Joe Brown and the other lead attorney, Hickman Ewing from Memphis, reading the indictment word for word, line for line, paragraph for paragraph, page for page, including those portions of the indictment relating to J.P. Morrell, who'd been dismissed at that time from the case. The defendants were not allowed to give an opening either. Their opening consisted of, Your Honor, my client pleads guilty to each and every, not guilty to each and every count of the indictment. Dang, that had only happened. Judge Neese also had very peculiar rules about cross-examination. During his cross-examination of Tommy Prater, one of the attorneys questioned Prater about his failing an FBI polygraph. Government counsel objected because, number one, polygraphs are inadmissible, and number two, Prater had actually passed 2 FBI polygraphs. Judge Neese overruled the objection, saying that it was cross-examination and the government could clear it up on redirect, which they did. The trial proceeded. The government called numerous witnesses and introduced lots of evidence. One of our witnesses was Arthur Baldwin, who had a very checkered past, but whose testimony was corroborated by the recordings that were made of his conversations with Taylor. Well, we did not know at the time that while Art Baldwin was in Nashville, he was meeting with a group of individuals to arrange to destroy the Classic Cat, which was a strip club located about 6th and Broad, opposite where the Bridgestone Arena was. And by the way, the Classic Cat was owned by his ex-wife. They were also conspiring to get rid of some strip joints in Memphis, where Art Baldwin was from. And so Baldwin's co-conspirators first attempted to burn the Classic Cat down. They weren't successful, so then they decided to blow it up. Fortunately, the bomb was discovered 20 minutes and defused 20 minutes before it was scheduled to go off, which was 3 p.m. Baldwin and his co-conspirators were later convicted, and Joe Brown and I had the pleasure of convicting Mr. Baldwin and his co-conspirators here. Another interesting incident involved an alleged attempt to tamper with the jury. Eddie Sisk reported to his attorney that he had been contacted by an unidentified man who said he had a friend on the jury who would vote for acquittal for $25,000. Sisk was to receive a phone call from the man at a phone booth in a Murfreesboro shopping center. The FBI was brought in, and the FBI brought in sophisticated telephone monitoring equipment and a surveillance airplane. Sisk went to Murfreesboro and answered the telephone when it rang. Sisk was heard by the agents who were in the area talking on the telephone. And after the phone call was over, Sisk described to the agents what had been discussed. However, when the tape recording was played, the only voice on the recording was that of Eddie Sisk. No other contact was ever reported to have been made with Sisk. The alleged jury tampering incident was widely reported in the media. After about 3 weeks of trial, Judge Neese had a heart attack and trial was suspended, and Judge Gilbert Merritt of the Sixth Circuit was appointed to replace Judge Neese. Upon renewed motion of the defendant Quillen, Judge Merritt severed his trial from that of the remaining co-defendants. The remaining co-defendants all wanted to proceed with trial in front of the same jury. The government took the position that a mistrial could properly be declared, but that it was ready and willing to proceed on in front of the same jury. Judge Merritt held a hearing on the motion, which included questioning the jurors, and declared a mistrial for 3 reasons: an alleged error committed by Judge Neese during the course of the trial, the diminished recollection of the jurors of the trial testimony, and the publicity concerning the alleged jury tampering incident, which had resulted in some of the jurors being either asked or teased about the alleged tampering. The defendants appealed Judge Merritt's decision on the ground that he had improperly declared the mistrial and that any further trial would therefore constitute double jeopardy. However, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals held that a mistrial was properly declared because of the jury tampering issue, but not because of Judge Neese's alleged error. The case was remanded, and we got our 4th trial judge, James Churchill of the Eastern District of Michigan, and trial was set. Prior to the beginning of the 2nd trial, we were approached by the attorney for Bill Thompson about a plea. Thompson had been convicted at that time of income tax violations in Chattanooga, and he had a very ill daughter. A plea agreement was reached with Thompson. Thompson was interviewed and confirmed the testimony of Prater, Bill Cole, and others about payoffs to Sisk for the release of inmates and the blocking of Prater's extradition. Just prior to the beginning of the 2nd trial, Judge Churchill said that he would not accept any plea deals after the trial began. Very shortly thereafter, Sisk and Taylor decided to plead guilty, and plea agreements were entered into which called for their truthful cooperation. And so we interviewed Sisk and Taylor, but the interviews did not go well. Sisk was interviewed, and we had serious questions about the truth of what he was saying. The first time Fred Taylor was interviewed, the interview was quickly aborted because the FBI agent who was leading the questioning discovered that Fred Taylor was wearing a tape recorder on him. And Fred said basically, "You did it to me, I'm going to do it to you." His second interview, without him wearing a recorder, went no better than Sisk's. Even though Sisk was not truthful and Taylor were not truthful, we decided to go ahead with the pleas, believing it would be good to have the birds in hand, and our belief that Charlie Benson would then plead guilty. We were wrong about that. Benson went to trial and was acquitted. Neither Sisk nor Taylor were called to testify by either party. When questioned about the verdict, one juror said, quote, "We all believed he was involved in what was going on, but the government didn't lock him into the proof." After the jury returned its verdict, Judge Churchill said in open court words to the effect that he guessed the people of Tennessee got the type of government they deserved. In later conversations with Joe Brown and me, Judge Churchill said he was baffled by the verdict and that the government had proven Benson's guilt. Sisk and Taylor were each sentenced to 5 years incarceration. Bill Thompson received a sentence to run concurrently with his sentence on the Chattanooga charges. The government dismissed the charges against Dale Quillen in light of Benson's acquittal and the fact that it would be extremely difficult to prove Quillen's involvement in 2 acts of racketeering as required by RICO. Sisk, Taylor, and Thompson appealed their convictions to the Sixth Circuit on the ground that the office of the governor of the state of Tennessee could not be an enterprise for purposes of RICO, which was the hot issue with RICO at that time. I had the very dubious distinction of being the first government lawyer to lose that argument before the 3-judge panel, but we ultimately prevailed in the rehearing en banc before the Sixth Circuit. This is now well-settled law, and RICO has been used in this and other districts to help prosecute other political corruption cases, such as that of former Davidson County Sheriff Fate Thomas. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Bill and David. We're going to take a 3... What? Come back at 3. Okay, he's holding up 3 fingers. I do everything he tells me to do. We're going to come back at 3 o'clock. That's about 12 minutes. If you haven't gotten your yellow sheet to sign up for credit for CLE, why don't you do that during the break and be back here, sitting down, ready to go at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Yours was good. I'd like to say one thing.